Hi, and welcome to week number 4 of Music Appreciation. I'm Arthur. Let's go. Today I'm continuing my overview of all the instruments in the orchestra. Last time I told you a little about the bass clarinet. We ended with the clarinet family, and then I introduced you to the saxophone family, and I pointed out the darker timbre of a classical saxophone sound versus a brighter jazz sound. I told you about a fugue, and we got to hear one. The word fugue, remember, comes from a word for flight, because the melody seems to fly from instrument to instrument. Then I introduced the oboe, and in particular we talked about the embouchure for the oboe. A very tiring instrument, the embouchure for the oboe. And oboists usually manufacture their own reeds from raw materials. We also talked about the bassoon. And then I talked and pointed out that the string section sounds much more homogeneous than the woodwind section, because the instruments in the string section are actually just larger or smaller versions of each other. The woodwinds are all pretty different from each other, and their sound reflects that uniqueness. Finally, I started the introduction to the brass section, talked about why some instruments sound brighter than others. One of the keys is the mouthpiece. Do you remember? What about a mouthpiece makes a brass instrument sound bright or dark? It's the depth of the cup depth. The cup is shallower in brighter instruments like the trumpet, and it's deep in the French horn. Then I went off onto a crazy tangent about why big instruments play low notes and smaller instruments play higher notes. And then that devolved into talking about the nature of sound and sound waves vibrating air and water molecules and how we hear sounds. Lastly, I recalled that there's no sound in the vacuum of space because there's no air to transmit those vibrations to your ears. Okay, review is over. I've been introducing you to the instruments of the orchestra one section at a time. We started with the conductor, and we made it through the string section, the woodwind section, and now we're in the middle of the brass section. I'm going to talk about overtones first, though, because brass instruments depend on them so much. So sit back, relax, and let this just wash over you. As I said before, sound is vibrations moving through the air or water, and musical notes are just those vibrations at a particular frequency. So you might ask, what do all frequencies sound like if you play them all at the same time? The answer is white noise. Now, you've heard it plenty of times when you've tuned a TV between stations. It sounds like this. So, white noise is what all frequencies at the same time sounds like. Now, when you play a note on a guitar, say a low A, you hear what we call the fundamental frequency, which is the predominant pitch. Boom. That's the top line of our drawing there in our picture. That's the representation of our string going back and forth. But the string also vibrates at multiples of the fundamental frequency, creating higher secondary pitches or overtones. So, if our fundamental note is 100 hertz or 100 vibrations per second, our first overtone is going to be 2 times 100 or 200 hertz. Our second overtone is 3 times 100 or 300 hertz. Our third overtone is 4 times 100 or 400 hertz, etc., etc., etc. So what does that sound like? Well, here is a guitarist playing a note, and then he cheats to force the guitar to play the first, and then the second, and then the third overtone. So you can hear just each overtone without the fundamental pitch. You're going to hear the fundamental, then the first, second, and finally the third overtone. Fundamental, first overtone, second overtone, third overtone. That's it. Now, the coolest thing is we don't normally hear all of those overtones, right? When he plays the note, we don't hear them. And we don't hear them because they're in such small amounts. And there aren't just 3 or 4 or even 6 overtones playing at the same time as that fundamental note. There are an indefinite amount. Each successive overtone just gets quieter and quieter. All right, that's very deep. And the question is, what does this overtone stuff have to do with music? At least a couple things. First, varying amounts of different overtones are what change the timbre of a sound. Timbre again. A guitar, for instance, has a characteristic amount of the first overtone, a characteristic amount of the second overtone, etc. You can think of each overtone as a spice that you add to your soup. Different amounts of each spice will change the flavor of your soup. And different amounts of each overtone change the timbre of the sound. Change amounts of the overtones, and you turn a guitar sound into a flute or a violin sound. Secondly, overtones are important to music because all brass instruments make sound by the players buzzing their lips at different overtone frequencies. They call them partials. Listen to this now. This is a trumpet player playing a whole bunch of notes on his instrument just by buzzing his lips at different overtone frequencies, or they call them partials. He's not moving his fingers at all. He's doing this strictly with his lips. By buzzing his or her lips at different frequencies, corresponding with overtones, and using the valves on the instrument, we can get 3 octaves or more out of a trumpet. Every brass instrument relies on overtones to be able to play notes. Here it is. Now, if we didn't have overtones or partials, the trumpet players and all brass players would be extremely limited in the number of notes that they could play. Maybe 7 chromatic notes. That's not even 1 octave. And brass instruments aren't alone in their use of overtones. The flute also gets its middle octave directly by forcing the first overtone to sound. Same fingerings, just a different embouchure bring out the middle octave. I'll show you. It just so happens that I play the flute. Low note and middle note. I'll do over here so you can see I'm not cheating. See how that works? Now, I can also force overtones on a flute a little bit. Flute players don't normally use multiple overtones like this, like brass players do. But I will do it just a little bit so you can see that overtones aren't unique just to a particular instrument. This is a property of acoustics. Here we go. I'm out of practice because I don't normally do that. Now, but you get the idea, right? A few weeks ago, when I was talking about string instruments, you got to hear the sound of overtones there as well. String players call them harmonics. It's just a different name for overtones. All right, that's enough for overtones for now. I talked about them at this moment because we were in the middle of the brass instrument introductions, and brass instruments use overtones a lot. I introduced the trumpet last time. Next up, the trombone. The name trombone comes from the Italian words for big trumpet, which is what it is. The most common is the tenor trombone, then the bass trombone that plays lower. There's also an alto trombone, which was popular in the old days, but it isn't used too much anymore. One way of classifying brass instruments is by the shape of the body of the instrument. There's a conical shape and there's a cylindrical shape. The bodies of conical instruments start small where you blow into them and gradually get larger as you get near the bell. The bodies of cylindrical instruments stay basically small until you get near the bell of the horn. Conical instruments tend to have a more dulcet tone. Cylindrical instruments tend to be more brassy. Here's a little bit of trumpet, a cylindrical instrument, trumpet, so you can get that sound in your ear. And now the same thing played with a flugelhorn, a conical instrument. Same notes, very similar horn, except one is cylindrical, this one is conical. Now, the difference between the two is primarily, wait for it, timbre. Back to timbre again. The same pitches, the same rhythm, one sounds brassier than the other though. Here's a little bit from a guy that to me put the flugelhorn on the map in the 1970s, Chuck Mangione. Again, listen for the more rounded tone this instrument gets. It's more of a piccolo tuba. flugelhorn. The last major member of the brass family is the tuba, another conical instrument with a deep mouthpiece, so you would expect it to have a brighter or a duller tone. Duller tone. Deep mouthpiece, conical bore, give an instrument that dulcet tone that you love so much. Let's hear a little bit of this instrument. It's not called for very much, but there is such a thing as a tuba mute. It's so huge that it's sort of funny to watch being put into the horn. I decided to show you this slightly comical process here.
Yama York here. So here you got Yama York. You need to put a mute in. Wham. Perfect. Now.
Whoom. The tuba pictured here you recognize, but you might have seen its brother, the sousaphone, even more. The sousaphone is a tuba in a different shape to make it easier to march while playing. As you might guess, it was invented for John Philip Sousa, the one and only. His original goal was an instrument that would disperse sound up and over the ensemble rather than the current tuba-type instruments available. The first sousaphones had bells that faced straight up to the sky, like this one. Its nickname was the rain catcher. I think you can see why. Later on, the bell direction was changed to the now popular forward-facing variety. All right, we've covered the string section, the woodwinds, and the brass. On to the percussion section. What is a percussion instrument? There are many different definitions by many different people. Like I've said before, a lot of terms in music are often decided in a very haphazard rather than a deliberative way. When we try to define what belongs in a percussion section, we have that kind of problem. The first definition of a percussion instrument that I remember was an instrument that was struck, usually with a stick. People who study world music try to categorize a vast array of musical instruments, instruments you've probably never seen before. Then they apply their definitions to our American symphony of instruments for good measure. There are some irregularities here. For this class, I'm interested in giving you an overview of the American Symphony Orchestra. To quote my mother, if a dog eats cat food, it's dog food. So I'm going to say that if it gets played by a symphony percussionist here, it's percussion. That doesn't make it right, but since most percussion instruments are played with sticks of some kind, it's worth talking about drumsticks for a moment. The kind of stick you use on an instrument changes the sound, and I want you to increase the sophistication or the complexity of your listening ability. So this is something to think about. You're probably all familiar with drumsticks like the ones used in jazz ensembles, marching bands, and the like. They come in different thicknesses and with different tips. As a percussionist, you care about the weight of a stick because you're probably looking for something that's light in your hand. You care about what the stick is made of for durability. You care about the appropriate volume that you play at, so thicker sticks are louder and thinner ones are softer. When you're playing jazz, lower volume and more control over what you play is usually desirable. Also, you want each stick in a pair to play as similarly as possible, which isn't always the case because wood is alive, and each wooden drumstick has a slightly different density and weight. It may look like a percussionist is being cavalier about how and where they're holding a drumstick in their hand, but that's not true. They might look like they're holding the drumstick with all the fingers in their hand, but they usually hold the stick lightly between their thumb and their forefinger, using it as a pivot point. If you hit a drum, or any other percussion instrument for that matter, the way that you'd swat a fly, the drum wouldn't sound right. You want the stick to hit the drum and recoil immediately so that the drum will ring, not thud. This is why drummers periodically drop drumsticks. It's not because they have butterfingers. They're only touching the stick normally with their thumb and their forefinger. Okay, that's regular drumsticks. Percussionists also use various mallets. Mallets generally have heads that are larger than the mallet shaft, and they're made of things like wood, plastic, rubber, or brass. Then there are mallets with a harder core that are wrapped with something like yarn, cord, or something else softer. Any idea what these are called? Wrapped mallets. Yep. Then there are felt mallets that often look like big Q-tips. One big reason I decided to talk about sticks and mallets at all is because they change the character of the instrument being played. So here's an example of the xylophone playing an excerpt. The first time using hard mallets, and the second time using soft mallets. It almost sounds like a different instrument the second time, doesn't it? Composers usually indicate the kind of mallets to be used on a percussion part, and there are even little stylized pictures that I've seen before to say what kind of mallets to use. It's not unusual for a single percussionist to play 4 or 5 different instruments during the course of a single composition. So the composer needs to distribute all the percussion parts in such a way as to enable all those parts to be physically played by the number of players available in the section. And enough rests need to be included as to give enough time for the players to change positions on stage when necessary and prepare to play different instruments. And it's not unusual to have to move instruments around from piece to piece. Fortunately, percussionists are normally trained how to play all the instruments in their section, though they may have their favorites and their strengths. In a performing ensemble, the first flutist normally always plays the first flute part, right? And the second trumpet player always plays the second trumpet part. In the percussion section, a particular percussionist may play the third part on one tune and the first part in another tune. I'm going to divide percussion instruments into 3 categories: pitched percussion, unpitched percussion, and the timpani. Pitched percussion is the name that we use for any instruments that play particular discrete notes. The instruments are usually physically laid out like a piano keyboard as well. I'm talking about ones like the xylophone, the marimba, and the tubular bells. It's true that certain instruments make a particular discernible pitch when they're played, like a tom-tom. Doom, doom, right? There is a pitch involved there. But we're not going to call them pitched percussion. We're going to say that if it's not playing melody notes, we're not going to call it a pitched instrument. And I can tell you from talking to several drummers that they tune their drums to get a resonant sound anyway, not for a particular pitch. I'm going to show you a picture of an instrument now, and you name it, okay? What is it? Marimba. If you said xylophone, you get half credit because it's really difficult to tell them apart by looking at them. To me, the big two differences are the sound. The xylophone usually gets played with harder mallets, so it sounds more brittle than the marimba. And the second thing is the look. The tubes that are hanging underneath the tone bars there, pointing toward the ground, they're usually short on a xylophone relative to a marimba. Those tubes are called resonators, by the way, because they sympathetically resonate and help to amplify the pitch of the tone bar above it. Let's hear a little bit of the marimba. Do you hear how the marimba is mellower than the xylophone? You may notice that the notes sustain just a little more too. Let's hear the xylophone one more time so you can hear the difference. The xylophone is more brittle, isn't it? Next up, I'll show you the picture. You name the instrument. Now, before you make up your mind, I'd like to point out that the tone bars pictured here are made of metal this time, not wood. Okay? It is a vibraphone, also called vibes. Also a popular jazz solo instrument. Let's hear a little bit of this. The notes on a vibraphone can sustain a long time if you've pressed the sustain bar down with your foot. And it can also play short notes when you leave the sustain bar up, like a piano. The vibraphone also has a vibrato type effect controllable by an electric motor and a switch. All right, what instrument is this? These are orchestra bells, also known as Glockenspiel. Comes from German words Glock, bell, and Spiel, to play, play bell. Remember, these are all called pitched percussion. Let's hear a little bit. All right, what are these? I'll let you hear them while you're thinking. Okay, what are they? Chimes. They sound like church bells, don't they? By design. That rack is about 6 feet tall, by the way. You use mallets and strike the chime on the top cap. That's all the time for this week. Have a great day, and don't forget to listen to music in a new way. There's always something new to hear in music. I'll be seeing you soon. Bye-bye.